So the first thing is let's pose the problem. Let's formalize the problem of, what exactly we want to do. What do we want to prove, right? So, so in general, what we're talking about in this room is the problem of, let's say you have a given RTL, right? This RTL is just a piece of code that describes the behavior of the chip, right? This RTL is producing some sort of netlist, and then this netlist is producing GDS, right? And then this GDS is fabricated into a physical chip. And the question that we want to confront here is, how do you prove that this comes from this, right? How do you prove that without revealing this, or potentially even without revealing the image of the chip publicly, right? Because if you think about it, if you're TSMC, if you didn't want this thing leaked, you probably wouldn't want the image also committed to on a public blockchain, right? Robert, I don't know what your model is of TSMC psychology. Would you agree with me? Like, they probably would not like that. No. Yeah. Yeah.
The amount of investment that they make in these absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, I was saying the investment and the IP that they have behind their GDS and the cutting edge ones are absolutely insane. I do think, I don't know, like, I mean, I made that statement jokingly about 180 nanometers. It's probably a lot smaller than that.
It's, I think,
before they stop caring as much.
130 is the lowest node open source available. It's at Google Skywater.
That is the lowest. Okay, that's not great.
I think you might just explain process nodes.
Sure. So process nodes work as follows. You have basically generations of chips that come out, and Moore's law says that they come out about every 18 months, right? And so 130 nanometer came out in like 2000 or 2001. 130 nanometer is the lowest process node available on an open source PDK.
Yeah, lowest means the most advanced.
The most advanced process node. So about, 2.5 decades old stuff. That is the best stuff that you have access to right now if you only care about open source. Sure. 90 is being worked on, I think. Sorry? Oh, beta. Okay. Yep. This one's mature. This one's in beta.
So maybe just write up what's the current process nodes.
So you have 65. You have 45. You have 32, 22. 16, 12, 7, 5, 3, 2. Okay, so we are now down here, and 2 is in beta at TSMC. So, by the way, every time you go down one of these lines, that's like a shrink by half, right? So the area goes down by half, the frequency increases by maybe 20%. So your overall performance per square millimeter of area actually goes up by over 2x, like 2.5 or something like that, right? So 2.5, 2.5, 2.5. You can imagine that this logarithmically adds up to a very big number, right? So basically between, let's say, 130 or 90 and 3, this is like 2.5 to the, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-ish, 7, 8, right? Like, yeah, it's up there into like this is like 100x if not more, like way more than 100x improvement in performance. Yes.
I've heard the term nation state, like implants, bad actors.
Yeah.
That like where the arrow is right now.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any actual like? Has there been a UFO sighting? Has there been an implant that's at that level that can actually like subvert all the systems you guys have to build these things and verify these things and like get through to get detected later? Like, I mean, that's the world or no?
Actually, Robert, you might have more intel on
Like,
this.
what's the chart look at for the actual exploits, so like implants that have been discovered in the wild?
I mean, I guess part of the problem is that they are really hard to detect, right?
There was that one Cisco thing that was like not on chip that was like
Yeah.
added that later.
Those are the easy ones to detect, and companies typically are not doing, you know, high resolution imaging based QA that detects this kind of stuff against GDS.
Out there we use those, by the way.
Yeah, I mean the concern here is that there's a strong likelihood that things like this would stay 0-day and just stay there. If somebody does kind of figure out it's a useful secret to keep it 0-day for them,
Like format string.
as well, because now you can start, you know, using it as well for your own purposes.
And to illustrate just how much this matters to nation states at this point, everything below, everything below 12 nanometer is prohibited from exporting to China as of today from TSMC. So like this stuff, like, you know, countries are paying very close attention to what TSMC does.
Oh, so the
And they're trying
VPU1 is
to-
going to go into China. You're clear.
Sorry?
VPU1 from Fabric then.
Yes, we are technically allowed to sell our product into China. As of today, we have no PRC customers, but
But you last part of my question, because you guys are smart, like you believe that people could do implants at that level, because they can really make these chips reliably, let alone subvert all the systems that they use to check them, right? Just curious if you think it's possible, you think it is, right?
Yeah, I mean, like where people have been like, you know, very, very worried about it has definitely been in communication, because, you know, an exploit in communication allows you to just kind of wiretap everything.
The XZ exploit, I'm gonna just like I'll spend money on software backdoors versus this is just like get one shot.
I want to tell a story of what it's been like to deal with TSMC. Okay, so one day I was in the offices uploading a file. Okay, so I was like uploading a GDS to TSMC, and you know, midway through it, I'm just like, you know, clicking around in the FTP, and I realized that actually, if I just click parent directory, I could see all of the other customers at TSMC, right? I'm in their offices, they're letting me see this, right? I could see NVIDIA, I could see Broadcom, and I didn't click on their folder because I didn't want to find out what happened to me after, like, let's say the internal police saw me click on that folder. I'm sure there were like 8 cameras trained on me, and I already like set some alarm off just by clicking on ... right? But that totally was there. It was right there. And I say this because I want to illustrate the level of cybersecurity. TSMC, on the one hand, has the world's only working nanotechnology. And then on the other hand, they have that. Okay, right. So just to kind of, and I'll tell another story, right? There was a guy who said, yeah, I have some files available from TSMC, right? I've heard of guys like this, right? They're in China and they're selling these TSMC files to other people for like 80K, 130K, right? Like they're just selling TSMC files. Where they got them, who knows, right? You have to imagine the level of access that those guys probably had to have, right? So, you know, is it being done? I don't know. But from story number 1 and story number 2, I think it is totally possible. Like it's much more within the realm of reason than you might think. Like TSMC is not a TE, basically.
Yeah, I mean, like I would say,
Sorry, I have a question, right? So like that process, the TSMC, you know, you could just like go through the entire supply chain of like from RTL chip, right? Or like list of factors that could actually subvert production. Is it mostly just TSMC that we're talking about?
Sure. I mean, so EDA goes into GDS, PDK, TSMC delivers the PDK, TSMC obviously delivers the chip, right? EDA also synthesizes the netlist, right? So there are a lot of points here that could theoretically subvert the process. So it's not just TSMC, it's Cadence and Synopsys.
This Fabric as well, right? Like I trust.
Sure. Yes. So manufacturer, or sorry, designer is also there, right? Yeah. IP is also being integrated.
TSMC is not the main worry because that's why people don't worry so much about manufacturing chips outside the US or Europe. The main worry, where you would do the attacks would be on the IP cores.
Yeah.
And these are made basically.
Yeah, just to kind of illustrate what this is like, right? You have a chip. Let's say you have the, fabric VPU, right? So we license GDDR from Cadence, right? They basically give you a block and they're like, okay, put this in, right? And you have wires in, right, at designated points, and they're just like, yeah, like we'll give you a black box that you can now like Control-C, Control-V right into that, right? What's in that box? Like, you don't know. You don't know.
Yeah, I
at
mean,
all.
basically is like a header file API.
Yeah.
And then what's inside gets inserted at the fab. For you, it's just an empty rectangle.
So one thing that I think is useful to also just understand is the mindset of people who are designing these components. When people keep things closed, there's like multiple justifications you can have, right? There's a security through obscurity justification. There's justification where you're trying to keep your design, your IP, like your like cutting edge technology private for economic reasons. But on the economic level, you could always just you could have like a business source license, right? Could you talk about
All right.
why this is not so easy?
I can certainly talk about that because I used to be in Bitcoin mining, okay? And, so in Bitcoin mining, you would have basically the GDS, and this is worth billions of dollars because if you really have like a Bitcoin mining design that is, the best, energy efficiency or like cost per terahash or whatever, that really is worth billions of dollars, right? And so they would go to incredible lengths, right? But I also heard stories of GDS being sold on the street and stuff like that, right? So it does very much happen that like that IP leaks out. And the moment it does, people like Bitmain basically exploit it, right? So there's like this incredible dog-eat-dog ecosystem that, it's much more like that in China, but even in Taiwan, it's like kind of like that, right? And, that like kind of shamelessly taking something that someone else built and just, out competing them based on, for example, superior supply chain connections or this or that, like that's totally just something that happens, right? Like you have a thing on Kickstarter and like literally 24 hours later, there will be a Shenzhen shop selling it for 1/10 the price on Amazon under some randomly generated string of letters name, right? Like this stuff happens, right? And so the mentality of the hardware designer is basically like, I would say number one, for like a typical hardware designer is like basically economic. And then like all the way at, maybe number 3 or 4 would be like security and security through obscurity. I would say there's a lot of like traditionalist thinking in the chip industry. I would say that people are very, very reluctant to change anything about how they do things. I mean, Robert, you can kind of. Yeah, it's. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like the driving need and, before crypto and what we're doing, the kind of people that really worried about this were pretty small group that had really important stuff. And, for everybody else in the commercial side, it just wasn't that big of a deal. And so we're kind of starting from very lax overall processes. I mean, there's, it's a little bit of like, I don't want to be totally pessimistic, in terms of like, I think for absolute security, really hard to get there. I think there's always low hanging fruit. And so we should try to close up as many of them as possible. But, I'm just a really big fan of, software, open, trustless cryptography methods,
Yeah,
as
definitely.
much as possible.
Just a quick, keep it on context or on the right format you guys are talking about, like FPGA to me is interesting because it's like this construct. I'm not a hardware guy. Like you just use software that just works, and then if it loses power, it just loses memory. Like, does that play a part in your heads and like where fabricated that's supposed to be? Like, should we think about that too? Or like, are FPGAs like using TLs? What are they?
Well,
This is not.
I mean, I think, and I don't know how much I've seen. I'm sure somebody's worked on like secure FPGA architectures because you do want to kind of hold them like a little more secure, but I would expect it's far, far behind.
Some of the magical stuff you mentioned about meshes, yeah, that could be on the FPGA, so it's tamper-proof and that could lose power and protect its memory, and then like software based, you could just
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of, it's not just though, like when it forgets it at the very end, there's like a lot of tapping stuff as it's kind of going along. That's more of a problem. I mean, I think like when Michael's talking about getting GDS and then analyzing it, it's sort of like when you have that, there's two things you can do with it. One is you can improve your own chip design. So very competitive, that's one IP loss. But the one I'm more concerned on that, because I mean, that's okay. Somebody else gets your secrets and makes a fast chip. No skin off my back. But the bigger one is that like, you can reverse assemble the GDS back into RTL. And then somebody can look at it. I mean, the shocking truth of like real system on chip designs is that, you think you have 12 cores and you have 200 cores and you've got a lot of like hard-coded microcode that, some of it is maybe even in some kind of PROM, but you're loading it in, doing all sorts of other things in there, and there's bugs and there's security leaks everywhere. And so if somebody's able to, take away the obscurity and then go in, now this is where you're really SOL.
And that's really more of a thing about legacy chips, right? Like if you're Intel, you have like 40 years of RTL that's like all in your repo, and like a lot of that code was written decades ago, right? It's like that old thing about like the COBOL programmers are actually like the most highly paid because they're all dead now, right? Like, so I think like
just were alive, yeah.
Intel's very much like that, right? I think that if you're like designing hardware from the ground up, it's far less like that in the sense that, okay, you just don't use that ROM and, stuff like that, right? But that is also an effort, right? Like to use the minimal set of IP that you absolutely need to use, like that is an effort in and of itself. The other thing you can do is like, you can just take these regions of the chip that you're licensing and you can basically say, I will prove to you that these pins are always encrypted as of the time that they get there. And you can also like have physical isolation of this versus like the other blocks of the chip, right? So you can prove things about the interface. You can prove things about, even like flyover wires that like, you might be using that connect like here to here, like you can enumerate all of those and you can prove things about those. So there are things that you can do to basically make the trust boundary outside of the IP and make sure that the IP itself is not an injection, point, right? Just like if you have this chip, but there is a supply chain attack on the PCB, which the chip is mounted on, right? Like you'd want it to be true that, let's say a power controller comes in and it's like some random component from Shenzhen, like it cannot influence the security of the chip in any way, right?
What is it for military applications? Is there a difference between the pipeline that's used for commercial chips versus
This one's a funny one because so I know a few people who like have been through the DoD procurement process. There are stories of random Chinese components ending up on the F-35. There are stories of actual hardware Trojans inserted into military assets, right? The military, so DARPA had a program called Zero Trust Fab a while ago, and then it didn't end up going anywhere because there just wasn't enough bureaucratic inertia within the military to really care about it. So like the military is like not all it's cracked up to be these days, basically.
Michael, I guess I'd add to that as well.
Yeah.
So after like 2018, the U.S. military did release this report that said all the missiles were susceptible to hacking in flight because their hardware systems were not secure. So after 2018, DARPA put out some consultations to fund adding secure enclaves into missile systems so they'd be secure when they're in flight. And actually, Skywater has been the primary people building these secure enclaves for U.S. missile systems since then. And so, like, I think something like 80% of Skywater's capacity now are these DoD contracts.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
And then most of the CHIPS Act funding Intel got was actually like $5 billion for secure enclave stuff for DoD.
That one's slightly less. But yeah. Yeah, the DoD is a major constituency.
So you were saying that having the SEM or like any image of the chip out in the open would not curry favor with TSMC.
Yeah.
But how much control do they have over that really? Like if you go on Silicon Pro and on there, like images that people have taken of betting chips, and we could do something like this where the designer, the trusted actor has very limited like a hand in the extraction of the image, right?
Yeah, but I mean, the problem on the top or even on the bottom back imaging is, what are we up to? 15, 18, 21 layers. Like,
Yeah.
it depends how much you want to pay for, because you can pay for more layers. But you're really like not seeing very much at all of the actual 3D mesh. So it's just a very partial information for anything that you would do. Like classically, if you wanted to really figure out a chip, then you would actually, etch it down, and then you would image each layer as you go. Even things like that can cause problems because, like, in fact, it may look like there's vias, but then there's not actually vias. There can be false vias in some places. So it's, tricks that people can pull, even as you're doing things like that. I don't know if people can image vias at this point, but that used to be pretty hard.
But I think these are two separate questions, right? One question is like, given that we can do some imaging, technically, can we get TSMC to be okay with the kind of imaging we're doing? And then there's the other question of like, can we do good imaging?
So just to be clear, TSMC is fine with people imaging their chips. They're not fine with those people publicly disseminating that. Now, the consequence for you to publicly disseminate an image of a TSMC chip is probably zero, because you are not a TSMC customer. You have nothing to do with them. Now, if we were to sell chips to a bunch of people who we know would disseminate those images, TSMC has a pretty good case that, hey, Fabric is now enabling the dissemination of TSMC trade secrets. Now, it doesn't matter whether that's like a sound legal case, because they would just kick us out. Like, they'd be like, you are attracting a lot of unwanted attention to images of our most sensitive stuff, right? So that's like the kind of thinking that they would have. Like, you would not want to do that.
At what process node level are there sufficiently many spams where one kicking you out is that big of a deal?
I would say that probably up there, like 90, something like that.
Oh, really? Not even 45?
I think 45 is pretty touchy, actually. 45 is the first, immersion lithography node. That's already like pretty sensitive. Maybe 65? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it just, I'm sorry, got some question, but I would say a lot of it points to, if you're really going to want to have trust in the hardware, you should try to minimize the amount of hardware that you're going to trust.
Let's come to my question. I think the thing you're representing is a TE you're building, right? I think your company that you're with.
I would say that we're like talking about a general approach.
Okay, so I'm talking
right?
about like what I need from a TE is not AES accelerated execution. I don't need 2 nanometer. I don't think like fabrication. And so if that's true, can you just use the open source, like go to like General Dynamics old fab in Phoenix, Arizona, and just kick the dust off of it and print it, like what we need, and not go down this crazy you guys are saying TSMC, I don't know, they're the only player in the space, but like, can we just not do that? Use the old stuff?
I think that you can certainly build a lower performance older chip, and for a lot of use cases that would be okay.
Because like the things that a lot of people do, like want to put a private key in there or generate a key in there, do RSA in there, and it's not like a general purpose CPU. But if you're building that, then it's a separate for like specialized hardware.
Yeah, I would say that there should be an entirely open source, TEE built to that spec, and then
But no one
there
has
should
made
be.
the Keystone thing you mentioned earlier has never been printed on like a chip that I can buy. Or like, so I don't know why. Like, it's weird. Like we're talking about all this insane tech and all these defense techniques that are important, but what's the easiest way we can get to a chip that I can play with the developer? Like, I don't know. Do we need all the?
So paradoxically, for a lot of older nodes, it turns out that the development time does not necessarily correlate with or anti-correlate with the node, right? So as an example, Skywater has a 130 nanometer node. And you might think, okay, it's 130 nanometers, so it'll come out faster.
Yeah.
And the design indeed will come out faster. Like, your 2-month long backend design on 12 is going to shrink to maybe like 1 month on 130. But that's 1 month. On the other hand, TSMC 12 has a cycle time of 2 months. So you submit GDS to TSMC, the chip comes out in 2 months. 130, if you go to Skywater, is like 6 to 9 months, right? I think I heard 5 to 6 months for like the first prototype
I
chip.
thought it'd be a lot different. It's not very dramatic at all. Like ratchet down and you get what, like a month or whatever. Okay. I thought
Yeah.
it was like way like you should go down there like
No,
get
like
that to get a old like
this is
fine
actually,
materials machine print one.
yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, this is actually easier, right? Like
Interesting.
for another thing, and this is like getting into the weeds a little bit, but you find a lot of designers who are only interested in working at the leading nodes. So even your access to talent and stuff like that.
Cares about it?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There's been a hand up for quite a while.
So my question is about these images that TSMC is being published. Are you
Mhm.
talking about GDS or even like this iris scanned images?
Iris might be more okay, honestly. I don't know, Robert. What's your take on that? Because like, it's like it would scare TSMC enough if I asked them that I don't even want to,
Like how big these images are, like in size of like bytes, terabytes, or
I think SEM scares them for sure, and then Iris like may or may not. But they jealously guard. So I heard about one case of a company that got kicked out of TSMC for saying in writing the node that they had access to in an email to someone else also with an NDA with TSMC. This is crazy, right? Like it's just like, oh, I have this node and I'm going to mention it to you, right? But that alone, that was enough, right?
Okay, it's perfect segue now. Sorry, I want to jump. Because I'm this getting, it's like more than 3 years, this whole SGX thing is bothering me like hell. And the thing is like, we're in Web3, cypherpunk, blockchain thing, and the whole thing, right, is about decentralization. So I want to challenge here the whole discussion. Okay? So most of the focus in a way has been on DeFi, but what is DeFi? Is decentralized finance. And what is that? We don't like central banks. We don't like, why? So this people believe it's possible to decentralize central banking. So why can't we do that with chip manufacturing? Because right now we're all even here in this discussion, we're circling around TSMC like it's a godlike thing.
It is. It's
And it
alchemy.
cannot
Alchemy
be
is very hard,
decentralized.
right? It's like
What?
there's a reason that like China can't copy TSMC direct. I think you
I don't care. I'm
It's hard.
challenging
It's hard to do
their
it.
thinking.
It's because of the ASML imaging machine.
There's ASML that is in Belgium. It's not in China. So anyway, or in
Yeah,
Taiwan, whatever. The point I'm trying to say here is that the thinking, okay, the reasoning, I feel like with the chip thing, the hardware thing, for whatever reason, we treat it as though that it's like some kind of God-given thing. Whereas this space has been capable, this community has been capable to reason totally differently with respect to central banking. So here, let's call it central manufacturing. If that works as a trick for tricking our own minds to, no, we want decentralized manufacturing. And I don't think that, let's separate things two here. I think we should be more meticulous in the way we reason, because if something is not possible because of political reasons or military reasons, and it's not possible because of technical reasons, that's different already, right? So I think we should also already do a job of like what is not possible because of physical reasons, like technological reasons, and what is not possible because of geopolitical reasons. And then just work through the problems. Because look, from my understanding of the hardware literature, the term manufacturer resistant, okay, appeared in 2002 in a master thesis on physical unclonable functions. Okay, so this space, this hardware research world, is really well aware of the problem with manufacturers, okay, for maybe different reasons of this crypto cypherpunk community, but it's totally not new, okay? So what I'm trying to say, there are paths here, there are ways, I think, to just face this thing head on and to try to just figure it out.
Right.
Do I make sense?
If I can say first, I mean, because you said two vectors there, geopolitical and technical.
Yeah.
But I would probably put the biggest one here is, the commercial angle. And, it's just not, no, I'm just saying it's not relevant enough. It's not a high enough factor for the dominant commercial revenue streams. And so, there's not going to be the monetary angle and effort from people to pay attention to that side of the market.
Okay, but this, right, I'm just brainstorming here. Like how much money was this like wormhole problem, like this bridge or whatever? Yeah, this was a bridge, right? That got hacked 300.
You can buy one machine with that money. Only one.
Yeah, but just to make operated. Still.
Yeah.
Well, hold on. You mean, hold on.
Like,
but Robert, you're talking about that. What do you mean? Like, you mean like there's not, hold on, because you're talking about like if we wanted to have our own fund.
Yeah, because when you say decentralized like foundry, there's, I'm trying to imagine what that would look like. I mean, it's, they're barely able to get these chips fabbed at, good defects and everything else, going through extremely careful pipelines that are inside one building with, massive physical controls and contaminants and everything else. And so, it's sort of a fully contained vertical process.
I just want to keep this discussion on track because I think what you're talking about is something that is in a 10-year roadmap and people should be working towards that. And then I think like what we're talking about here is like what can be practical in like a much smaller time, right? And
Sure, okay. But just as a thing,
Can we
though.
just kind of chat, because we've had a lot of similar discussions with different subset of folks. So I think for the purpose of this discussion, because we also have an open source hardware session with Audrey Tang and in the DevCon venue. So I think a lot more I would advise us to kind of prepare lightning talks where you want to explore a particular path and then we systematically explore it. But here, I think what is valuable is that it builds upon what Quintus has surveyed, but particularly target possibly if we say 2080, probably much even like as not even 80, it's like 98% of the market, right? How do you leverage what capitalism, commercial forces has built, and how do we actually use what they have, but keep us the ability to verify? And that is a really like valuable and important, I think, path that we should actually just articulate. And I think we can do the cross comparison later on. I think we here all agree with the ethos. I think what we are stuck on, but it should be different sessions, hopefully. Number one, what applications, what type of things at stake would have essentially how much security, which is like essentially what Robert is the expert on. How should what kind? So like when we think about designing a chip, that's very specific. And what kind of things do we actually need to think about designing an ideal chip, or designing a signing oracle? What is the trade-off? Like, can we maybe just get to do a quick 5-minute like signing oracle example, and ideal chip example, like 12 nanometer, 1/3 nanometer. Just this is done this before. That's the most like I would say helpful framing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a signing oracle, right, which can be used as the basis for a secure element for, like, for example, a hardware wallet or something like that, which could be used as the basis for account encumbrance, right? Like things like that. Like a signing oracle can be done in 130 nanometer. If you want anything high performance, like for example, block building or things like that, that is where you have to consider much lower nodes, right? If you can find a way to trust the lower nodes output, then you should just build the thing in the lower nodes because it has strictly better performance and, you know, just like you can run more things with this thing. Why would you only have a signing oracle? But if you cannot find a way to trust the lower nodes, then a signing oracle in an open source 130 nanometer PDK makes a lot of sense because, like, why wouldn't you, you know, just want that, right? You might even say, you know, both make sense, right? I think that's a valid viewpoint. Like both make sense, just like cryptography and TEs both make sense. You know, varying levels of security, varying kind of application requirements, you know, and the trade-off between them. There's no one perfect solution. Like all of them really make a lot of sense, right? So that's kind of how I view it. Is, you know, they all make a lot of sense, right? We've done kind of the whiteboarding exercise for signing oracles already on 130 nanometer. Like it can be done, right? Like it totally is possible. This particular thing is to see, can you even push it further in the short term, right? Because Fabric is building low node chips. We could, you know, if we could solve this part, then we could easily put this thing on our Gen 2 and just ship it, right? Like there could be a chip that you can buy with this functionality with a boatload of compute also attached to it. But you don't necessarily need that for all of the use cases.
Yeah, I guess fully agree with all of that, so I won't repeat it. I would kind of add that, I mean, I am optimistic in general that, you know, we're going to have effectively, like, I mean, I kind of made the assertion that everybody kind of jumped on a little bit that, you know, the money aspect of stealing money has been less interesting compared to, like, you know, getting into private data. But one, you know, and I agree with people that there are a lot of people who would like to still steal money. The stealing data is kind of problematic because you don't really know if somebody's stolen data. I mean, did they get it? Did they not? The good thing in crypto about stealing money is that it's pretty visible that exploits have happened. So I think, you know, there's a good reason to believe that there'll be a lot more of these sort of like, you know, security by obscurity type bugs and problems that will get found. You know, increasingly it'll be valuable enough for people to do that. It'll be visible. Everyone will be able to know that's happening. So I think there's going to be, you know, increasing push on, you know, finding bugs and doing things better. I don't know if there's some out of box things, like could we actually get some chip makers to kind of certify that their process is, you know, the process of making chips has enough controls. We haven't talked about it, but like when I've wanted to increase security, because I actually had businesses where we made boxes and PCBs and others, like, you know, you actually have some employees that are just sleeping at the factory and they're like watching every step, and it makes it harder for bad things to happen because they're, you know, kind of verifying there's not some funky thing happening, you know, in terms of somebody switching out one of the lithography plates or what have you. I know you're laughing, but
Yeah.
so yeah, so I think there's some good forces there. I guess I don't want to be like, you know, right now my mind is tracked a little bit into one place as I was thinking about this in the days leading up to here, which is this really kind of like, you know, because we can now couple, you know, these, you know, much more verifiable nodes for the things that you really care about, like the signing oracle cases. You know, and so like there is that path, and that is viable in the current day, and with very accelerated software, trustless software based methods, you then can extend that.
Verifiable node, development, it's like a government, who's spending to make that happen? Like, who wants that? Like, not just this group, I'm guessing, like, why does,
Like current open PDKs.
why is that happening? Because you're excited about like the trend in verifiable nodes. Such a.
Well, no, I was actually saying more of like what I was saying is because of people hacking and finding exploits in hardware. I think to a large degree, the kind of things that you could, hack with hardware exploits before crypto were more of the thing of, basically getting data on people. And so more of the spying variety, which you're not going to know is happening, just frankly.
And I think these are all good discussions, but taking it back to how do we actually make this happen? I think there are some good calculations to be done on, can you actually create a zero knowledge proof of these things on the board, right? Like that could,
I have a very pointed question that to me would be like an existence proof that you can't do it.
sure.
What can you do without opening the EDA? Or maybe they'll open EDAs that are good enough. But like from my understanding, any proof you make that connects the RTL to the GDS or the netlist to the GDS without revealing the EDA bakes in this assumption that the EDA is like good to go. And if the EDA is not public, then you're just trusting cadence.
You want to take this one?
I mean, you can, completely independent tool chain, reverse compile the GDS back into an RTL. And then you can basically do verification that those two are, effectively matching. You may not be able to get it perfect, but, it's entirely separate path. So I don't think that problem is insurmountable.
Yeah, I want to add on to that. Basically, the functionality here in the RTL, first of all, multiple people can go buy the EDA and like get the same netlist, right? So you can kind of do almost an optimistic thing with that. The second thing is like both this and this are simulatable. And the third thing is there is actually a formal verification method called LEC, logical equivalence check, that basically checks whether the netlist is equivalent to the RTL. So like there are multiple levels of safeguards that you would usually use even in the process of designing a chip.
I understand. So netlist to RTL makes sense. I didn't fully understand what you were saying, Robert, about the independent tool chain. Do you mean there's other closed source software that we can use to go from GDS to netlist, or do open source tools exist for this?
I'm not sure on what the state of the art. You're saying LEC is available now, so you can do that. So you really just need to basically, reverse assemble back from GDS to netlist.
Yeah, I think, you don't have to go all the way back from GDS to, GDS to netlist like that. Totally, you can, that's basically LVS, right? And then this is imaging, right?
LVS is layout versus schematic.
I think like you can just write your own LVS engine. That's not too hard,
What's the tooling called?
I don't know which tool you were saying in the LVS family.
I mean, just all of them. Like I'm kind of speaking in a generality, but for every like step in this chain, there's already like a formal tool that does that thing, right? Like, so for example, for GDS versus netlist, it would be LVS. I think his question was about RTL to netlist, and then it would.
Was about the LVS.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I mean, the LVS is like, if I draw this, right? And I want to compare this to this graph, right? I don't need a closed source tool to do that for me. I mean, it's nice to have the closed source tool, but I can write my own tool that figures out that this is isomorphic to that, right? Yeah, as long as you back annotate like, okay, this is the location of this cell, and then like you can just flood fill the wires and you can do that thing, right? Like that is not a big deal.
Or maybe naive question, but like at the end of the day, we want to have our physical chip to match RTL, right? So
Yes.
why don't we make like a proof from physical chip to RTL without like doing like all the proofs like in the middle?
Because you would do that only by doing all those proofs in the middle, right? Like, first of all, you have to image the physical chip. You have to compare the image to a non-fuzzy thing that you think it is, which is GDS. And then you have to compare that against the logical net that you think it is, right? So that's netlist. And then you have to compare netlist with the functionality that is open source.
Why cannot I just like compare physical chip with netlist directly?
You can, but the fuzzy rectangles are so fuzzy that, like, I don't.
I can do some fuzzy matching like without going. Yes. Netlist is like
The GDS is the painting, you know, the GDS is a bunch of rectangles that describe what's going to be painted on the chip in metal and, you know, various dopants and everything. So,
You're
I'm-
better off going through the GDS because you can commit cryptographically to one GDS, right? Like, if, for example, I had separate like proving pads where I go directly from physical chip to netlist, and then for the next chip, I fuzzily match that one too, right? Then that creates lots of opportunities for the attacker to like fuzz it, right? Whereas if I have to go through one GDS that I already committed to publicly, that's like a little harder, right? Like, intuitively speaking. Because like this is fuzzy. So we need to make sure that that doesn't introduce too many security vulnerabilities.
So I have like a fuzzy matching into GDS, which I don't publish like only commit to, right?
Yes.
Then I want to do like this GDS versus netlist.
Yes.
Is netlist some sort of like directed graph? Can I think about netlist directed?
In fact, undirected. It's
Undirected.
yeah,
Okay,
it's just a graph. It's
Just
just
a graph. Okay.
yeah. Yes.
Building off the question about comparing physical chips to the net list, like I have heard of tools that go from SEM to netlist. I don't know how good they are, but I was curious if you guys know anything like that. It's like not LGS,
You
but trying to guess the netlist from a SEM.
yeah, I mean, you can do that. It's almost just like semantic segmentation, right? Like it's a classic kind of image recognition problem, right? So it's not that specific to chip design, like things that recognize outlines and draw graphs based on them. Like that's totally just a thing, right? Like biologists use tools like that all the time, right? But you wouldn't want to go through that because again, you want, you know, something hard to commit to.
It's easier to go the
Yeah, exactly. And besides, you'll need something like GDS because it's hard to prove that this is equivalent to a netlist without also the netlist having annotated locations, right? Like if I give you two graphs and I say, hey, Quintus, prove that these are isomorphic. That's an NP complete problem,
But you have
right?
approximation.
Sure, but like you don't want to run those in ZK, right? Like that's going to be nasty, right?
Not that nasty.
Really? Like what's the complexity of a typical one?
It depends on the quality, but it's like polynomial with like 2, 3.
I mean, if it's O of n cubed and n is billions of gates, then you're screwed.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's
I mean,
the problem.
like that's the kind of problem where you'd first run it through outside of the ZK circuit, and then you would give it a trace to verify, right?
Yeah, you would have to do fiat Shamir and basically only prove like certain random sampled parts of it or something.
So where'd you guys introduce zkP to this? Where's you were talking about hardware, and I got you on or
We're
whatever.
about a fundraise where you were adding the acronyms on.
It was ZK the whole time because you don't want to reveal the GDS, right? So the ideal is that you create a ZKP of this.
Okay, oh my gosh, that's what we're doing here.
Now, if you had a TEE that you trusted that was capable of large amounts of computation, then you could do that too. But, you know, again, you would need the lower node trustless TEE to be able to do that, right?
Might as well just.
So So yeah, so maybe you just present the problem since we're almost running out of time. The math problem.
Well, the math problem is proving this, right? So I like on one hand, I have like a fuzzy thing, right? Like I ran Bunny's iris scan on the chip, right? So I have like the faint outlines of standard cells, right? And then here I have a netlist. And the netlist is annotated with, okay, this gate appears at this location, right? How do I prove in a computationally reasonable amount of time that this is equivalent to this, right? And I think there are a lot of like tricks you can play. Like, for example, let's say you have like a chip, right? And let's say that somehow you've bounded the Trojans to be at least a certain size, right? Then you could easily like randomly sample the chip and only prove like half of it is equivalent, and then you can save time that way, right? But if the Trojan could be a single capacitor, right? At that point, you probably won't hit it unless you literally pass the whole thing through a zk scan, right? So there's like a zk computation versus how big can you bound the Trojan to be kind of like trade-off, right?
How big this netlist is? How many
Well,
nodes that have?
As many as you've decided how much, how much logic to put in that hardware.
so here's the neat thing, right? If you make, so this is getting into the weeds, but basically, let's say that you have a TEE, right? And let's say one core of the TEE is 1 square millimeter, right? And then let's say that like, yeah, that's my point. Like, let's say that I have like basically 100 cores, right? Or whatever it is, right? Then, if each core is imaging identical to the next core, right? Which it never will be quite identical, right? But like you could make it mostly identical to the next core, right? Then that means you only have to solve the problem for one, and then you have to fuzzy match all the other ones to that one, right? So there are also ways to simplify the problem that way.
And because of hardware Trojans can be one gate only, is that possible? But that's small.
They,
That was example, like,
yeah, you can have a single capacitor hardware Trojan that gives a gateway to fault injection attacks.
yeah,
Right.
that's ridiculous. Okay.
There was a paper that proved this. Yes.
So, like, I want to make 2 points about the computational overhead. One is we only need to do this like once, right? Maybe a couple of times. But once you've established this for an image, that image becomes the public reference, and we can compare future images to that image. But I'm working on an assumption, maybe it's wrong. And the other thing I wanted to say before you correct me is most TE exploits have been breaking confidentiality, not integrity. So, if we just try to do something over the short term, why don't we, like, one thing we could do is just say we have some image comparison algorithm that works. We have the LVS. We put that in the TE, maybe 5 different TEs or 5 different manufacturers. As long as the integrity holds, then we use those proofs to construct the zk proof and the guarantees, the hardware guarantees we have. That seems like not a terrible thing to do.
Interesting. I mean, but the Intel root key can be just extracted from these.
Because
It can be. It can.
And that would be the kind of thing that would be non-preventable at the protocol level, because you have a correlated attack on the entire, install base. Right.
yeah, I don't agree with this confidentiality versus integrity thing. It's not your argument. Many people give this argument, but in current case, the main problem is the key. And the key means if you have the key, you can forge attestation, and attestation means you attack both integrity and confidence.
That is true. But in order to extract the key, based on what we know, in the current model, you use physical access. So if you take a TDX running in Azure and a TDX running in GCP and AMD ACB and some guys trust zone and LiPo, and everybody wants to do that as well, like whatever, and we combine these. And I think especially
your trust model now is your trust model then is that you trust both the cloud and the manufacturer to prove that the manufacturer in this one instant did its job properly.
Yeah, what are the failure modes there? Okay, one is that the GDS leaks, right? And let's just put that aside. That is like a different kind of concern. We have to assure the file of that. But if we want to just make sure that this mapping is correct, it would require us or this large set of actors to all collude to break these TEs so that each one of them says that this proof checks out when it doesn't. You know, so it's like it's not trustless, but it is certainly much better than like, you know, no guarantee whatsoever.
I could actually buy this, you know, like it would be hard to believe that they have physical access to all of, let's say, Amazon, Google, and everyone else. Like it just, yeah, that's kind of hard to. Even North Korea, it would be hard to simultaneously breach Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and whoever, like, right? Apple. I mean, you can't run it on your phone, right? Like, you. Sure.
I want to just like, in the interest of time, I think we should probably wrap up and maybe leave for some other dedicated sessions. Because I think on the one hand, you seem to disagree with the computational complexity or even feasibility of that particular, essentially the zkLVS approach. So that's one thing that I think could be worthwhile going deeper. On the other hand, there's much easier solutions that you can adopt. I'm pretty certain that all of the people, including GCP and others, would already be doing that, and they probably will when the cost effectiveness But the question is, if we were to do something together, if the protocol itself is broken, is it even worth doing it? Because the commercial actors are going to have millions of times of capital to do exactly what you said in terms of a small optimization. And that's not innovation. And it's probably also even for an extremely wealthy, whether it's a startup or a community, it probably is not the best use of our time and capital. Just to compete for the sake of competing. It's all finding those gaps that actually no one dares touch, like the open source hub. If true, that's big. Then, and also the zkLVS. It may be hard, but what if we actually just focus on trying to see if we end up in a dead end or not? I think ultimately a lot of these just end up in the marginal cost versus marginal benefit analysis, and it's to pick the things that our community. And I buy this. I mean, like all of you. Hopefully, I'll see many of you many times in the future. Just like I've seen Michael since like July, and I've seen him pretty much every other week on some couches in some cities. Yeah, so I think these are hard problems, and I think not every team is going to solve all of the problems, but Simple Crypto is going to solve the problem from the academic way, and probably is going to set a really high standard. And between the really applied approach that requires billions of dollars versus billions of dollars actually do something that can help us leapfrog and save tens of years. Why not choose the latter?
I just want to really quickly dovetail on this. Like, you guys are thinking, great, like there's some use cases that matter that can help adoption. Like, for instance, if your tech gets in the world and people start posting proofs on their GitHub repos, service providers that don't have those proofs are like, you look bad. Like, why don't you have this, like the Chrome lock, like SSL thing, like circa 2014? Like, all of a sudden now you need an SSL source. So like I hope you guys are successful. You don't take too long, because I want every service provider that has hardware to have these proofs on their wherever we're on chain and GitHub repos. And like, that's a cool, like, it's cringe that your service provider does not have that proof, right? So like, it doesn't even be perfect. Like, there's use cases that I don't care if you decap a chip, I don't care if the info leaks, but like, let's get these things out into the world. So like, what are these cool, easy, you don't need to solve all these problems. Like I would still use it if it was, I don't care if North Korea leaks my key. I still want to have, I want to verify and trust. So there's like, hope you guys think through some of these easier, like, let's just figure out ways to get it out there.
Yeah, for sure. I think the reason that we're talking about these harder things is because we think that even these are very feasible within a shorter amount of time, right? Like, for example, this zkLVS thing builds upon lots of innovation in the zkVM space, right? Like, we wouldn't have to like write a custom zk circuit in order to present these, you know, LVS things, right? So that goes a long way, right? And so like everything that we're talking about is something that we actually think is feasible.
I'm really excited.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
I was going to make one final comment that, you know, Tina tried to refocus us a little bit on like talking about a use case. I do think that, you know, those types of discussions where we're talking about specific concrete examples with walkthroughs of like where we feel like we need the security. Because I don't know if like, Michael's, maybe it's clearer for you, but like, you know, in a sense on the hardware side and these others, there's different kind of like primitives, if you want to call them, of, you know, levels of hardware trust or levels of hardware assurance. And for someone who then is looking at a use case and then trying to fit what are the right kind of, you know, protocol mechanisms and, and should we actually on the cryptography side try to be looking at primitives that we don't have on the software side of like, like the like the point, that was being raised here about the confidentiality aspect on TEEs has the wrong property, which is that if you run it 5 times, you've increased the likelihood of losing confidentiality. But, is there actually like an N of M threshold that still is efficient enough where you are actually getting a redundant array of like, like certain trust threshold, and then like Michael and others are saying, much harder to actually physically, compromise multiple facilities and lots of other things. So yeah, concrete use cases, I think, is really important for us to make progress.
And I would certainly say that, concrete use cases, there are plenty of them. I can go into kind of like the need for security in all of those. And then, specifically in regard to, compromising the cloud, I think it's necessary to point out that TDX still has, things like, trust domain violation attacks that can happen from running user code that's cleverly constructed and maybe like figures out a way around the hardware protections. Whereas if you properly architect a trustless TE, then you wouldn't have that problem. Now, in the specific case of LVS, it's okay because this is like one piece of software that you're vetting for the cloud. But if you're running arbitrary user code, like you're probably screwed with even that.
We will. We're going to shove Ubuntu into TDS. Like,
Yeah.
Stop this running.
Yeah, definitely.